Welcome to Reinventing Capitalism, where tech, social entrepreneurship, and impact meet to create the businesses that will lead to a sustainable future. I'm your host, Claudia Thomas. Today, we have Simon, founder of Ponterra, an operator and developer of nature reforestation projects. As a 2-time social entrepreneur, he emphasizes his optimism in creating innovative solutions that will help solve the current most challenging global problems. First, we delve into his love for nature, and he explains with key stats what drove him to make the transition to the climate industry. Then, we explore Ponterra's 10,000-acre project in Panama, the role of the local communities, and the involvement of investors like Microsoft. We then move on to discussing social entrepreneurship and how to make the transition into the impact world. Finally, he gives us a glimpse into the future of nature and climate. Join us to explore how Simon's work at Ponterra is transforming how we restore nature while also achieving financial results. Simon, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start. Let's go straight to the point. You are not one, but a 2-time social entrepreneur who is aiming at solving the climate crisis. Tell us why. Why people that have tuned in today should continue to listen to this conversation.
You keep saying the 2 times founder, but I'm actually 1.5 because the previous one was not really successful. So let's call it 1.5. Anyways, why? I think that without sounding too pessimistic, you know by now that I'm not a pessimistic. In fact, I say that I sell optimism in a way with our projects. So, but still, I think that the summary of it is that we have no choice. We're living as if we had another planet to go to. We're depleting the earth of its natural resources and in general just creating systems that are not sustainable. And looking at sustainable and the word sustainability for what it really means, which is, can we continue to do this over time? The reality is no. I focus on something very specifically, which is how we look at nature and how we, factor it in with everything that we do. And the reality is that how we've put nature traditionally in our systems and how we've looked at it is not sustainable over time. We've lost roughly 70% of wildlife species in the past 50 years, and there's about 1 million additional species, tree and animal species, that are endangered at this stage. So it's truly not sustainable. That's sort of the bottom line.
Wow, this data is really thought-provoking. How did you get into this? Like, what's your trajectory?
I started my career in something very traditional. Started with doing investment banking in London. In fact, I think that's the first time that we met. And then I went back to uni with the idea of doing a PhD in something completely different, totally unrelated, in philosophy of economics. And the topic of that research was, can we look at the difference between the price and the value of an asset? Without going into too much detail, I'll give you one specific case study, which is how I started to be interested in the natural capital side of things. It says, imagine a tree. So traditionally, up to this point in time, we've normally valued a tree by what it's worth when it's dead, right? So you chop down a tree, you make a table or a chair out of it. What's the price of that chair? Well, that's the price of a tree, right? So the value of a tree is the value of that tree when it's dead, or the price of it. The reality is that in general, the value of that tree is way higher. And in fact, it's way higher when it's alive. Carbon credits, which is one of the topics that I guess we'll cover, is a new mechanism that starts to realize these values, right? So the tree, when it's alive, it sequesters carbon. The fact that it sequesters carbon is something that you can put a price on. So a carbon credit is a way to start realizing the fact that a tree is worth something also when it's alive. That combined with my trajectory and the little stats that I gave you and around how we need to change our relationship to nature was I think I'm going into that.
I love how you've put it because it's a way of looking at externalities. So these negative externalities that we have from production and that have come come from capitalism and these market-based practices, we never really think about them because they were unpriced. And you've put a great example on how to finally price these externalities. So you figure all these out and you start your first company, Bajira. What was Bajira and what went wrong?
And basically, we were a connector. So, like many other startups, in which your business model is being in the middle of everything and taking a cut on both ends. The long and the short of it, of why it didn't work, is because we were trying to be the intermediary in an industry that had very little projects, and it did have investors, but of certain profile. And that certain profile was that they were very big. So they said, okay, my minimum ticket is 50 million. If I'm a startup and I'm trying to connect these two, it's very hard to match the two things. Again, so why did it fail? It was probably trying to serve a very illiquid market with a like this intermediary role with a very small fee and a lot of work involved in it. So not a great business model in a market. But in it also helped us, or helped me personally, see what was the actual gap in this market, which is projects. Like the one thing that everyone is missing is supply, high quality supply of nature restoration projects. And then the demand will come, and probably we don't even need those intermediaries that I was trying to do with Bagheera.
How does that lead to Ponterra, which is the project that we're going to talk about today?
Yes. So Ponterra is effectively that. When I was saying like there's a gap in the market for nature restoration projects, that's effectively what Ponterra is. So we're a large scale developer and operator of nature restoration projects. What that means is effectively we work in mostly right now we're working in Panama. We have a large project there. We're working in Mexico as well, but with a big focus in the tropical areas of the world to restore what has been previously degraded agricultural lands. So, putting as an example our first project that we have in Panama, that's a 10,000 hectare restoration project where we work with a farmer that has been, because of their traditional activity, over exploiting their land, cutting down the trees, burning down the land. And because of that, the land is completely degraded. When the land is degraded, the water leaves, obviously the animals leave, the soil erodes, so there's no nutrients. So even if you want to grow something or have a cow there, it's not possible. What we do is we set up a program in which we reforest those lands, issue a carbon credit, and hence can pay the farmer in the long term, and then develop like a nature conservation project that extends in perpetuity so that that thing that used to be a very degraded land turns into a forest forever.
So you said 10,000 acres.
Yeah, so 10,000 hectares is only actually it's the first phase of the project. And 10,000 hectares is roughly twice the size of Manhattan. And that is the area that we're reforesting, as in like literally putting the trees on the ground. Then you have the adjacent area, which is area that you're conserving, like preserving other areas. And then the expansion, which in the case of Panama, the specific project will go up to 50,000 hectares of
Wow,
reforestation. So it's large scale projects.
it's massive. So it seems that the community plays a huge role in your project, right? Well, what's the role of the local community and why is it important?
One thing that I didn't say about us as a project developer is that, contrarily to what has been done in the past, which was normally that people acquire the lands in order for to do their projects, in our case we lease them in a way. So we don't buy the land from the farmer, but we set up a long-term contract which starts with 40 years and ends up being a total of 100, in which we work with the farmer or the landowner, the smallholder farmer, to co-develop this project. So you're absolutely right. Communities is at the center of what we do, because if this project doesn't work from a social perspective and it doesn't provide a real economic alternative to what they're doing now, no one will sign up to my project. So there's the dual angle of like, we're doing good in environmental terms and we need to restore our nature, and it has all the positive impacts in terms of biodiversity restoration and carbon sequestration, but also you're creating a new parallel economy just for the first project that we're doing, we're leaving $70 million in the Azuero Peninsula, which is that region in Panama that we're working with. So that's the extent to which we collaborate with communities.
Wow, $70 million. It's not a small sum of money. And I love that your first clients are really the local farmers. Without them, you wouldn't go anywhere. How much funding do you need for a project like this?
Well, I mean, I gave away the 70 million mark, so you can imagine that it's large sums. So how this is structured normally is we've basically copied what other industries have done in the past. Nature restoration as an asset class is fairly new, but there's other industries that not so long ago have been in a similar position. For example, renewables, right? So it has a very similar thing in that it's projects that are super long term, and they require a lot of capex investment. So a lot of like actual doing the work on the ground and spending on like trucks, on the nursery, on producing the saplings, all of these things. How you finance this normally is you identify a site, you say, this is where I'll do a project. You create the whole project design and you do a prediction of how much carbon you're going to sequester over time, right? With that, you can go to a final buyer. In our case for Panama, it was Microsoft mainly, who was the biggest off taker. They say, well, we have an issuance period of the next 30 to 40 years in which we know with good certainty that we'll sequester this amount of carbon. Are you interested in buying the credits? And then when you have those credits, that's where you can go and find the immediate funding that would be required to launch the project, right? Again, going to renewables, it's the same thing. You say, okay, I'll be producing energy for a long period of time, but the investment in the beginning, which is literally like going to that country and putting the solar panels, that's the big investment. So it's not really public in terms of the figures that we need to raise. But what is interesting in this case and what you need to solve for is the fact that most of the investment is concentrated in like the first 5 to 6 years, right? So the cost curve is like, and then it goes down. So it's
Yeah.
how do you mix that, how do you put the funding mix so that you have the Microsoft who will be buying credits almost forever, and then that's financing piece that gives you the money now.
First of all, congratulations on signing Microsoft. It seems like you guys closed a very chunky deal, undisclosed though, because I was looking for data and indeed I couldn't find the actual amount that Microsoft invested. Um, do all investors need to buy carbon credits, or are you also looking for commercial investors?
Good question. So, two pieces to this question. The first one is, are the project that we're doing necessary, regardless of whether or not you believe in an offset? I'd like to think, and hopefully everyone listening to this agrees, that restoring and preserving nature as we know it is something essential, despite or regardless of how you put the carbon offset within that mix. So even if you found a solution to get rid of all greenhouse gases that are currently that are above the levels that we would want to, you would still need to conserve and preserve nature. So that's sort of like, do these projects need to exist? The answer is yes. Do all companies need to invest in carbon offsets? I also believe that's the case. Why? In every corporate strategy, again, going back to sustainability, to be more sustainable over time, there's two things to the equation, right? First, you try to reduce your emissions and, you said it very rightly, your negative externalities as much as possible. But then you reach a point where you need to offset, right? So there's only a maximum where you can reduce. And then there's a point in which if you truly want to be net zero in terms of carbon, but also nature positive, which is a label that is growing every day, you need to do something and buy those offsets. So again, even if you don't believe purely, or you're a bit of a skeptic in the offset market, you would still need to do these projects. So maybe they would be paid in a different format, maybe through like public funding, corporates, whatever it is that you said. And then the other piece is, do all corporates need to do this? Well, probably what is now the voluntary markets will turn into mandatory. And yes, it will be a requirement that is part of the sustainability strategy. First you reduce and then you compensate.
I get that. And how do you make money? Is it the difference between the cost of the project and the sales of the carbon credits?
Yes, so it's the first truly easy to understand business model of a startup that I've done. Yes. So basically, at Ponterra, we're vertically integrated, and what that means is basically we take care of everything for the development of the project, from picking up the seeds, peeling them, producing the saplings, storing them in our nursery, transporting them to the sites, then planting them, measuring them. So I'm doing the full scale. Um, what that means is that it's very easy to get our development and operating cost at the end of the day factors in everything, right? So if my cost to develop and operate this project in perpetuity is, say, whatever, we'll say a random number, 10, and I can sell it for 15 in terms of the credit, that's my margin. And then obviously, as we operate the project, there's also a business model of which again replicates very much what renewable energy companies do. There's the person that will develop the project, sell the energy upfront mostly. The other one is saying, I will continue to operate those solar panels over time. I might get a fee. So if you combine those two things, there's a margin, and then there's like an operating fee that you might have in perpetuity, because again, this is super long term.
What comes first, impact or money?
Oof, big debate question. So I think we don't shy away from the fact that Ponterra that we're a commercial developer, right? So there's been traditionally this industry, and when I say this industry, I mean like nature preservation or conservation, has had amazing operators, people that had great initiatives to like restore 100 hectares in this place, or like a whole community-based project that, I don't know, changed like a specific economy in a very local place. But these things have normally been very small scale and traditionally led by NGOs. And I'm not saying these are wrong, obviously not. It's been, what I was saying is this has been great work. But if you want to truly scale this, I believe that there's a requirement to have a commercial project developer that can make profits and scale as a company, potentially also realize economies of scale. We had our project in Panama first. We're expanding Panama as a country now. We have a team in Mexico as well, and we're considering an additional country right now. That gives you economies of scale, right? Again, similar to if you were an infrastructure company, a real estate company. The first building is always going to be more expensive than if you have like 10 buildings in one city and you're operating all of them. So in order for this to scale, and I think the beginning of what we said is that we need to scale this, our systems are not sustainable, you need a commercial point of view. So I think my answer then is that they're not detached. So if you truly want to create impact, you probably need to allow for companies that actually make profits. And the third piece to this equation is that if you create the impact, I can make the profits, then private capital will also come in the mix, right? So if traditionally this has only been done by NGOs, the funding for those NGOs was also non-commercial capital. As long as there's someone like me that can help an investor also make a return with these projects, then the private equity guys come in the mix. Venture capital can fund you in the early stages. You can create blended finance things, all of these mechanisms that can truly scale the industry. So I think it's not the attached one from the other.
I completely agree. At the end of the day, what really moves resources is capital and allowing investors to make money. And the reinventing capitalism idea is to show that you can have an impact while making money. So definitely, I agree that these two things can be blended together. And I hope that with a little bit of time, we see more of these projects where you can have both. Something that really struck me is that your project timeline is 100 years. And I read that less than 1% of companies in the world last more than 100 years. How do you guarantee the success of your initiatives?
That's a very good question. So in carbon project development terms, that's called permanence. It's actually one of the big critiques that you have for nature-based solutions, which is what we do. Why? Because it's very hard to ensure that that forest will keep standing forever. And that's a bit of like what we need to work with in order for this project to be truly valuable. So it's a very key point. I think personally how we're solving this is, again, we have a contract with these landowners, right? So we're trying to put in place as many mechanisms as possible to ensure that that contract is sustained over time. So it's not only a contract that is with the current landowner, but also you designate like the direct descendancy. So it will also be with them. It's something that you also file in the public registry in Panama in this case, which makes the contract public. So everyone that operates in that land knows that by law, that has to be a forest forever. But then there's the other interesting component, which is you can have as many legal mechanisms as you want. But what you need to ensure is what we were saying before, that this project really works for the communities on the ground, right? So maybe in the beginning it works, everyone is super excited and they say, we're going to restore nature, we're doing something good for nature. And at the same time, it's great because I'm making more money. But will this change over time? We don't know exactly how it will change. The key to this is that we need to be open for it to change. So we always need to keep in mind that the crucial figure in this project is the people that are on the ground, the smallholder farmers that own those properties, and they need to be engaged to continue to preserve nature. I think that as we progress, we'll have more and more incentives to offer. So this won't be a problem because if anything, the industry is maturing towards a place that everyone is recognizing this more and more. Not only a company like mine, but also the government, also like international initiatives. But the truth is, in order to ensure permanence, you need to have that legally binding structure as professional as possible, replicating what others have done in the past, but also be open to the fact that you're working with people. And how do you ensure that they're collaborative over time?
Yeah, and you're right that if you make sure that the local communities buy into the product and you add value to those communities, which it seems that you are, then this will be transferred from generation to generation, and that's how the project will last more than 100 years. What's the biggest challenge you faced to date?
I think the biggest challenge is what we were saying. So how do you engage the local communities, wherever it is that you're working, so they understand that this thing has value, and it not only has value from like a global perspective, where like we need to do this, but also it has value for them. I'm going to quote Mexico now. We're in Mexico. We're working mostly with cattle ranchers, farmers that have been having cows on their lands for generations and generations. And because of like the thinning margins that they have, because their land is not productive, they are making less and less money. What we're doing is we're suggesting a new business model for them in which imagine like 100-hectare property. What we do is we say we're going to reforest a part of it. We're going to create a native forest of what used to be there that will also be connected with like our other forests so that you create like a corridor. And then if you have cows, you might continue to have the cows, but we'll change the system and you have those cows towards like more sustainable, more animal friendly, all of these things. The key thing or the hardest challenge is that you're working with someone that has ingrained in them traditional practices that they've been passing on generations from generations. So as much as they want to understand the fact that the forest is important, you need to really convince them. And one key point of that is making like the numbers work. So no one is really going to sign up to a project in which they lose money. That's a very myopic or naive view that someone would take probably if you don't know the realities of what happens on the ground. But then, even if the numbers work, there's a thing of like, no, this is how you do things. Cows need to live in like a plain field with no trees because that's how they live well. And it's already quite well known that if you just chop down the trees from a land, eventually, after a few years, the water leaves, the water disappears, the land is bare, the cows die, and cows want shade as well. So, and I'm being very specific here, but what I'm saying is you need to convince someone with a very ingrained mentality on how you do things. And for us, sometimes it seems very straightforward, sitting where we are, privileged, like privileged country saying we need to restore nature. Everyone will agree. But then how do you pass on that message to the people that are actually on the ground?
I love that. It must not be easy because the backgrounds are completely different. Speaking about challenges, I know you've done a few Ironmans, a few triathlons. What role do sports play in your day-to-day life and I guess overcoming challenges?
I just think it's very fun. But starting with Starting the day with a bit of sports. Look, I travel a lot. I've traveled a lot lately. That creates a bit of an imbalance as well. So I think everyone is a bit different, but I actually do like a bit of routine and having a few things in the day that are semi-fixed. So for me, that is how I start my day. And I think it's been a few years now that I can't start my day without first doing sports. And that's sort of the constant. So wherever you are, you're in Mexico City, big city, whatever it is, there's always a place to go running, right? And it's also a great way to meet people, you know. But then you're in the middle of nowhere in a project. Same thing. There's always a place that you can go and do sports and whatever. So for me, I think it's created a bit of, at least in the past years, where because of starting two companies or in general, like being what they say as an entrepreneur, everything is like different every day, right? When they say, what's your typical day look like? Every day is different by definition. But if you have a few things that are always the same and you can wake up and do your sport, that creates sort of like a mental balance in which you say, I can be anywhere. Sorry to be so direct, but shit can hit the fan for the rest of the day, which is probably what will happen. But I've already done my little thing, right? Mental balance.
It keeps you sane. It keeps you
Yeah,
sane.
exactly.
I want to quickly go back to the carbon credits. Ponterra is releasing 3.2 million carbon credits. Some of our listeners might think that while Ponterra is doing a great job at restoring ecosystems, Ponterra is also the middleman helping big tech offset their carbon emissions. Like due to AI, for example, big tech like Microsoft are increasing their emissions by 30%. So aren't we talking about offsetting the emissions rather than solving the problem from the roots?
Another very big critique of what we do. I think with this one, I'll be very short. So there's already, well, we know firsthand that there's a big correlation, or there's, yeah, a very big correlation between how much a company reduces their emissions and then the amount of money that they spend on offsets. What I mean by this is that the big spenders in the carbon offset market and the voluntary markets are also the ones that are investing more heavily in decarbonizing their supply chains. So if we go to Microsoft, Microsoft is among the biggest promoters and like buyers in the space. They are also the ones that are leading the decarbonization within their supply chain. That's the first thing, which is it's not separated one from the other. And then the other thing is very simply, if the price of an offset is high enough, it will always make more sense to decarbonize and make your value chain more sustainable before going and buying an offset. So part of why the transaction numbers that we were talking about before are not public is because it's a very high credit, high priced credit. But that is also what makes it worth more in a way, obviously. But what I mean by this is worth more from an intrinsic perspective. Like it ensured that the companies that bought it take every measure possible before buying that credit, because if not, it wouldn't make sense economically. So I think that's sort of where we stand. If the price is high enough, it will always make sense.
Yeah, so the fact that companies are paying for the offsets for the carbon credits, it's also an incentive for them to rethink their logistics and how they do things. Moving into social entrepreneurship, we've described how a mission-driven company, where impact comes first, can also have financial returns. Some of our listeners today might be uninspired with their company's mission, might want to work for an impact company, but there's a misconception that mission driven companies lack the capital or talent that commercial ventures benefit from. And this might be holding them back from making the switch. What are the three things that you would tell them?
It's always three, yeah. When you ask of something, always three things. I think first there's a misconception that what you were saying of the lack of talent. I have never ever felt surrounded by so much talent than what I'm doing now. Like the amount of people that are, everyone is smarter in this industry. It's like because it's a very interesting time in which you're uniting people that see this from like this is what's coming next, but others that are saying like if I don't work in this and we don't solve this, again, I think we'll have to move into another planet, and I don't want this. So it's a very unique. It's a very unique a combination of people wanting for these things to work. How I would approach the switch, or the move towards something that you find more meaningful, is the reality is that there's a need to redo or rethink most of the processes. This happens at every level, even with the most, I will say, quote unquote, boring companies. There's a need to rethink how we make our materials. Cement, for example. Cement can sound super boring. We'll continue to make buildings. We need to find a way in which cement is done in a more sustainable, carbon efficient way. We need to find a way in which we live in the buildings that is more sustainable. If we're really going to electrify everything, we need to rethink the energy sources. I'm touching a lot of points just to say that there's certain new rules to the game, and almost every company will have to play by them. So it's not like you're a climate or like you're a social impact company or the rest. There's a few people that still haven't done the mindset shift, but if you're within a company as big or small as it is, and you have that mindset, you can acknowledge that you need to change the process and the systems of how you do it. So again, if you're in that cement company, you might be willing to change how that works. So I think there's a potential to have a purpose, to have impact, whatever it is, however it is that you want to put it, in almost everything that we do, which is also a great opportunity. Like going back to the optimism thing, like there's a unique chance for us to start doing things differently, how we collaborate, all of these things.
Yeah, and for what you're saying, not only you can improve existing companies, but rather create new ones. So with all these problems, like all these global sustainable and development goals, a lot of opportunities will arise. So I guess that will also lead to new companies and new job opportunities.
Yep, completely.
So what are the three things?
What are the three things that you would do if you wanted to transition from that, right?
Yeah,
Then, okay, so the big one that I was saying is it doesn't necessarily need to be a drastic change, right? It could be just like looking within your organization, how do you make your contribution a bit more meaningful or towards a specific like contribution. Maybe the second one, if you do want to make that transition, is understanding, if the word is impact, where you want to have a bit of impact. So I always say very upfront as well, like I focus on something very specific. It's nature restoration. If you ask me around like what is the future of EVs or how is the energy transition looking, or if we have to go nuclear in order to whatever, I don't really know the answer. So I have chosen something very specific that is a true passion of mine that I saw as a potential business opportunity as well. But if you were to ask me, I would be outside in nature all day. So there is an element of like really liking what you do. And it doesn't only have to be with like cool stuff like nature. Again, I'm using the cement one and nailing that. But if you've studied chemistry and you're looking at it from like the chemical perspective of like how do you make new materials, that is something that can be very exciting, but with a different lens, right? With a
yeah.
different purpose of it. So first of all, don't grill yourself. You can make an impact wherever you are. If you do want to go into something, pick something, because it's very hard to say I'm solving the climate crisis in general. Pick something that is specific that you can do on your day-to-day basis. And I think I'll stick with two because I don't have a third one.
The third one could be the talent. The fact that there's a lot of talent in these industries because there's a lot of people wanting to make a change and have a positive impact.
True. So true. Maybe it's like be open, speak to people. There's a lot of people that are very, very interested from different lenses, like because they think they can make a big buck. They think they need this in order for our systems to work. They're looking at it from a purely philosophical perspective of like, this is the way in which we will unite the global north and the global south. Whatever it is, but speak to people. I think there's a lot of people that are very, very talented.
We have one last question. Let's imagine you're looking into a crystal ball that shows you the future. What do you think will happen with nature, the climate, and the world in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think the first one is that you said nature and climate. We will continue to look at these things together, right? So there's a recognition of the interdependencies between nature and climate. And we've been looking at them from like totally detached things. NGOs is what we'll look at, nature from one end, and then we'll have all these climate tech ventures that solve the climate crisis from like a very software driven AI perspective. Probably you can't do it this way. So there's a need to merge these things. In all the conferences we've been at lately, nature and climate go hand in hand already. So that's the first crystal ball. Maybe not necessarily because it's quite immediate. Then I'm pretty hopeful that there is a new generation of what I say is climate or social optimists. So sometimes with these social changes, what tends to happen is that there's first a big wave of anxiety. With climate, it's been very clear because we've seen a lot of movements of people saying like, well, this planet is going to become uninhabitable. We're all going to die. You're ruining our generations. These people are the devils. When the reality is that this is a very good trigger to action. But if you actually want to start doing something, you need to move towards like maybe you can't only call it optimism, but saying like, look, I believe that there is a future in which we can do this, and that's why I'm working towards it. Because if you're just saying we're doomed, there's not really an incentive to do anything. So my crystal ball, hopefully, of what I'm starting to see at a social or generational level is that people are looking at this with an optimistic lens. And then maybe the final one, which links to this one, is how corporates are reacting to this and how investment and private capital, because they're starting to see first the opportunity, second the optimism and like willingness to change. From an investment point of view, we're also seeing a shift in which all of these initiatives are not looked at from a marketing perspective of saying, yes, we're green, and more of like, well, this is a real investment in my company. So with the clients that we speak with, it's not the CSR, it's not corporate social responsibility teams we speak to, it's the investment teams, which are thinking, how do I sustain a future for my company? Which links to what we were saying. If I don't do this, my company is not sustainable, out. So I think those are the three. We had three this time.
This conversation has been about threes. Thank you so much, Simon. I've loved our conversation and learned a lot.
Thank you very much. It's super cool that you're doing this initiative. Good luck with the upcoming ones.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.